Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning to a certain degree, and good evening since I'm doing this on Thursday night. So what we're going to do is we're going to pick up with the courts chapter, go ahead and finish that, and then depending upon whether we have time or not, we'll go ahead and scratch the surface of civil rights and civil liberties, just to go ahead and get us moving along. So at last we met, if you recall, we were putting together the court system, both the state system as well as the federal system. We're going to focus more so on the federal system today, picking up really with the United States Supreme Court. All right, so go ahead and look at your outline. We'll start here with the United States Supreme Court and start with the appointment process. Now, for the most part, you should be very familiar with the appointment process. Remember that the United States President will nominate somebody for the United States Supreme Court. This is true of all Article 3 judges, all right, and that nomination is subject to a majority vote in the United States Senate. So in order to get confirmed, you need to convince 51 senators or 50 senators plus the vice president in the case of a tie, which of course had just happened recently. So again, with Justice Kavanaugh being the newest United States Supreme Court justice and joining the court, and through this process, I think we've actually learned quite a bit about the Supreme Court nomination process. Okay, so that part you should be pretty familiar with. Again, we spent a lot of time during the presidency chapter talking about those things, but I also want to reintroduce senatorial courtesy. Now, again, we first talked about this when it came to the process by which the heads of various administrative agencies, the cabinet secretaries, etc., ambassadors are nominated and confirmed. And if you remember with senatorial courtesy, it's basically kind of a custom. It's certainly not anything that's written in the Constitution or even in statute or even administrative code, whereby if the nominee, in this particular case for a federal judicial position, is from a particular state and a senator in that particular state doesn't approve, then the president, if the president is of the same political party as that senator, again, the president will check in with that senator. If that senator doesn't really approve of that nominee, then the president simply will just not put forward that candidate's nomination. So imagine, again, here, if we had a judicial candidate from the state of Ohio, we have a Republican president, President Trump. President Trump would check in with Senator Rob Portman, who's a Republican, and say, what do you think? Is this person you would want to be on the federal courts, on the United States Supreme Court? And if Senator Portman said no, then President Trump would go ahead and pull back the nomination. So again, for the most part, just looking at the potential nominee's state, really, and looking at the political party of the president, and and specifically whether the president's party matches the political party of one of the two U.S. senators. Okay, now, going forward just a little bit more and looking at the difference between original jurisdiction and appellate jurisdiction. Now, if you remember when we were looking at Marbury versus Madison, we did talk a little bit about the United States Supreme Court's original jurisdiction. And we mentioned that part of the original jurisdiction in Article 3, as it's enumerated in Article 3, deals with cases involving ambassadors, consuls, ministers, basically high-ranking foreign diplomats. And Chief Justice Marshall had pointed out, say, wait a minute, now writ of mandamus is nowhere included in this, so the statute creating the writ of mandamus was unconstitutional, and basically told William Marbury, you're in the wrong court and you got to start over at the district court level where that authority would make sense. Okay, so that's part of the original jurisdiction of the United States Supreme Court, is to deal with cases that involve ambassadors, ministers, consuls, high-ranking foreign diplomats. The second part to original jurisdiction actually deals with cases in which a state is a party, say the state of Ohio, the state of Michigan, etc. It's rarely invoked in that manner. So that's actually very, very rare. And actually, original jurisdiction for the United States Supreme Court is incredibly rare. Now, the other thing that I would like to mention, still talking a little bit about original jurisdiction, is the fact that the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court actually presides over impeachment cases. Now, it's not really a true sense of original jurisdiction, but the Chief Justice, currently John Roberts, would preside over any impeachment trial that's held in the United States Senate. If you remember, when we looked at the Congress chapter, it's the House of Representatives that has the power to actually impeach a federal officer, be it the president, vice president, an ambassador, actually another federal judge, what have you. And the Senate actually has the power to try. But it's actually the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court that actually presides over that trial. So when President Clinton in 1998 was impeached and then tried later, it was actually Chief Justice Rehnquist that had presided over the trial. Okay, now the appellate jurisdiction for the United States Supreme Court is much broader. It includes a lot more in the way of potential caseload. All right. Now we can summarize the appellate jurisdiction actually very easily. All right. It involves certainly cases involving questions of federal law, all right, and that could mean federal statute, the Constitution, federal administrative law, etc. It also involves cases whereby a federal party is involved in the case. So it could be the United States Postal Service, okay? So again, appellate jurisdiction, of course, you think about all the various sources of federal law that could actually create a condition whereby the United States Supreme Court would hear a case on appeal. But what I would tell you is to go back to your chart, right, when we were looking at the various levels of courts, and we were kind of painting the whole picture of the state and federal judicial systems next to each other. And remember, all those cases start in trial courts, right? And we mentioned that there were 3 ways in which you can get a case to the United States Supreme Court through appellate jurisdiction. One way was through the Circuit Court of Appeals, all right? Another route was through the state Supreme Courts, assuming it was a question of federal law. And then also, there are some civil rights and civil liberties cases that can go straight from the U.S. District Court actually to the United States Supreme Court. Okay, now, with that said, let's talk a little bit about a very special rule called the Rule of 4. Now again, this is also an example of a rule that's not in the United States Constitution. It's not in a statute. It is a custom. And the United States Supreme Court is very much based on custom and practice and ritual, if you will. Okay, now the Rule of 4 is basically used to determine which cases the United States Supreme Court will hear. Okay, so we have 9 justices on the United States Supreme Court, 4 of which, less than a majority, 4 of which have to agree to hear a particular case, right? Now, interestingly enough, it's actually tough to get that group of 4 to agree. The United States Supreme Court gets roughly 11,000 cases appealed to it through those 3 ways that we mentioned earlier, from the circuit courts, from the state Supreme Courts, and again, those few cases that come from the U.S. District Court that are civil rights and civil liberties cases. We won't get into the specifics on those, all right? But they hear less than 100 cases per term, and actually it's been averaging right around 80. So you think about the chances, the likelihood that your case will get heard by the United States Supreme Court is actually very, very low. Okay. Now, a couple of things about that. Number one, it tells you, specific to what we're talking about here, that the Rule of 4, even though less than a majority, is a pretty high hurdle. All right, getting 4 justices to go ahead and agree to hear one of those cases. Again, one of those 80 out of 11,000 is pretty tough. The other thing it tells you, and I think this is a very important thing to get down in your notes, is that if there are 11,000 potential cases that could wind up in the lap of the United States Supreme Court, this, and the fact that only 80 are heard on average, this makes the circuit courts and the state Supreme Courts actually very powerful. Okay? So you think about it this way. The overwhelming majority of those litigants that want to go to the United States Supreme Court never get there, and whatever decision, right, was made at the U.S. Circuit Courts or at the state Supreme Court, that's the final decision. That's it. All right? Now, to tie all of this together, and you probably can see where we're headed, is that the United States Supreme Court gets to pick and choose what cases it wants to hear in regard to appellate jurisdiction. Okay, so think about, we were just talking about appellate jurisdiction, questions of federal law, the Constitution, administrative rules, statutes, treaties, right? Maybe I forgot to mention that one, but certainly federal treaties. Think of all these different possible cases, right? Chances are the case is just going to stop at the state Supreme Court or the circuit courts, which makes those courts very, very strong. Okay, and we're going to talk here in a second about the cases the Supreme Court is likely to hear. But again, rule of 4. Very much a high hurdle, right, to getting your case accepted by the United States Supreme Court. And again, because of that high hurdle, those lower courts, if you will, state Supreme Courts, U.S. Circuit Courts, become very strong courts. They make a lot of policy. They set a lot of judicial policy. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the types of cases the United States Supreme Court is likely to hear. All right, and these are lists compiled by political scientists, legal historians, lawyers that kind of say, okay, well, what are the commonalities when we think about the 80 or so Supreme Court cases that are actually being heard. Now, interestingly enough, when I was in your seat, when I was in college and I was studying political science and learning about this stuff, the dockets for the United States Supreme Court were much bigger. They were right around 200, 250 cases. The United States Supreme Court has purposefully tried to scale that back. So, what might give your case an extra shot in the arm, right? Give your case an extra shot at being heard by the United States Supreme Court. Okay, the first category, and the category that's going to give your case the greatest chance, are cases involving civil rights and civil liberties. The United States Supreme Court, for many decades now, has really since the 1950s and 60s, has seen it as a real responsibility to hear cases involving civil rights and civil liberties. Now, again, it doesn't matter whether the court is leaning liberal or leaning conservative. There is a thirst for cases involving civil rights and civil liberties, but political scientists, historians, lawyers can really trace that back to really the 1950s and really kind of that idea put on steroids in the 1960s when more and more cases involving civil rights and civil liberties were being heard by the United States Supreme Court. But this had a lot to do with the fact that was what was in vogue. That was what the country was really debating at that time. And when we get to the next two chapters, when we really take a deeper dive into civil rights and civil liberties, we'll see that. Okay, so number 2, all right, is the Supreme Court's own agenda. All right, now this gets to be a little bit trickier, but we've just gone through a pretty rough Supreme Court justice confirmation process. And, you know, certainly there are people that lean left and people that lean right, and if you're leaning left, you oppose Justice Kavanaugh's, Judge Kavanaugh, as he was a nominee. Now, Justice Kavanaugh's confirmation, those leaning right were certainly in support. We have this belief that Supreme Court justices have their agenda. Now, they go through a confirmation process, certainly saying that they don't, right? They're very, very careful. All justices have learned quite a bit as to how to kind of hide their own beliefs, but if nothing else, we know that the presidents that are nominating them and the senators that are confirming them all certainly have an agenda, and that helps us kind of paint a picture as to what the Supreme Court's own agenda might be. So if it's leaning right, we know there are certain types of cases the Supreme Court's likely to hear based on its agenda, and in contrast, the same would be true if the Supreme Court is leaning towards the left. Okay, all right, so that's 2 types. 3, anytime 2 circuits disagree. All right. So if you remember when we were going through the court structure and I had to put on the board, all right, we were looking at the federal system and the state system kind of together, and we'll pick that back up on Monday because I'll be able to put it back on the board. And there's a couple things I want to finish up there. However, if you remember, I mentioned the states that are in the 6th Circuit, right? Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Michigan, and the 7th Circuit, Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. Now, it is possible, of course, that the same question of federal law, could be federal constitution, federal statutes, federal administrative law, treaties, what have you, or even when a federal party is involved in the case, that the question could be answered differently in the Sixth Circuit than the Seventh. Well, if you remember, we had mentioned that the United States Supreme Court has a real incentive to try to unify the law. So, if the answer in the Sixth Circuit is yes and the answer in the Seventh Circuit is no, there's a real incentive to try to tie those cases together. A great example, and it's a little dated, this was the early part of the last decade, but the question as to whether school vouchers was constitutional or whether it infringed upon the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. In the Sixth Circuit, the answer was, yeah, you can do this. And the Seventh Circuit was, no, you can't do this. You can't give state money to religious schools, even in a school voucher system. And the Supreme Court took the case and pretty much unified the law to the point where, in the Zellman case, the answer is, yeah, you can do that. You can use state money to support school vouchers to get kids out of what any particular state would consider a poorly performing district, basically trying to get kids so they can escape out of school districts that are believed to be not doing so well. All right, but nonetheless, okay, so that's that. All right, now fourth, and one that we often forget, is any time the Solicitor General recommends to the United States Supreme Court that it should hear a case, that case has a better chance at being accepted by the United States Supreme Court. Now, the Solicitor General is the third-ranking person in the Justice Department. This is the person that represents the United States at oral argument in the United States Supreme Court, and that office, of course, has deputy solicitors that represent the United States in oral arguments at the intermediate appellate level, the circuit courts, if you will. Okay, but if the Solicitor General says, you know what, Supreme Court, this is a case we should hear, right? You should hear, that you should accept, all right, to hear. That does statistically give the case a little bit of a better chance at being heard, right? Now, as you can imagine, the Solicitor General is absolutely an appointee of the United States President, so this is one way in which the President's agenda kind of gets moved through the judicial system. Again, right now, if the Trump administration sees a case that's moving its way either through the state system or through the circuit courts of appeal and believes that this is important to their agenda, they'll probably have an idea as to which way they want the case to come out. They can certainly command the Solicitor General to write a brief supporting the United States Supreme Court in accepting that particular case. Now, again, civil rights and civil liberties, the Supreme Court's own agenda, when two or more circuits disagree, and when the Solicitor General suggests that the Supreme Court should hear it. Now, is it possible that all of those things could be true? Absolutely. If you have a civil rights and civil liberties case where two circuits are disagreeing on the status of the law, it's part of the Supreme Court's own agenda, and the Solicitor General says you should hear it, Supreme Court, chances are the Supreme Court's going to hear it. You have at least a better chance. Okay, now, with that said, let's talk a little bit about constitutional interpretation of the United States Supreme Court. But I also, in doing so, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the checks that we have against the United States Supreme Court in its own exercise of judicial authority. So, if you look at your outline, you see there are basically four different methods of constitutional interpretation. Now, this is better couched in perhaps theory. This is the work of political scientists, historians, some legal scholars looking at thousands and thousands and thousands of judicial decisions, and generally just focusing more so on the United States Supreme Court than anything else. But again, putting all these thousands and thousands of cases together and kind of putting them into four different buckets in terms of what the Supreme Court has kind of developed as a theory of interpretation, even if they have never admitted this, right? Okay, so we start with original intent. Now, original intent is the idea that we interpret the Constitution as the framers would have written it. All right. So in other words, what did John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison mean when they wrote this down? Okay. All right. So if you think about it, all right, it's Justice Scalia, the late Justice Scalia, who was a very, very colorful justice. He always had some pretty interesting stuff to say. He said he believed the Constitution was dead, and then he kind of changed his language a little bit, said, and he meant enduring. All right, the idea is that it kind of froze in time in terms of its meaning, right, in 1787, and that was it, right? That's it. That's the Constitution, okay? Now, with that said, of course, the idea is that original intent doesn't necessarily take into consideration the amendments. Legal historians, political scientists, some legal scholars go back and forth as to whether you can really mix original intent with some form of interpretation of the amendments, and sometimes it's very, very difficult. The Bill of Rights is probably a little bit easier because, again, the Bill of Rights was attached to the United States Supreme Court very, very quickly after its ratification. If you remember, that was one of the chief compromises to the ratification of the Constitution, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. All right, so original intent. All right, Constitution is dead, to borrow Justice Scalia's language, and we interpret it as the framers would have interpreted it, okay? Now, when we get into civil rights and civil liberties, I don't think there's any need to necessarily go further here with each one of these forms of interpretation, but nonetheless, I think it's good to get them introduced here, but we will certainly put them in application when we get to the next two chapters on civil rights and civil liberties. Okay, literal meaning. All right, literal meaning means we interpret the Constitution based on the words that are in it. Right? Maybe not necessarily how the framers meant it, but we look at what these words mean. All right? So a judge or a justice that's interpreting the Constitution based on a literal meaning theory, they're going to get out the dictionary quite a bit. All right? So if it says Congress shall pass no law, that means you open it up and see what those words mean. Congress shall pass no law abridging blah, blah, blah. Right? And again, we won't go any further here, but it's good to just kind of introduce these methods of constitutional interpretation, but we'll certainly apply them when we get to the next two chapters. Okay, the normative approach, and sometimes the normative approach is called the flexible approach, right? Why? We interpret the Constitution using a normative approach. We interpret the Constitution based on society as it is today. All right, so a modern approach, right? And to kind of go back to Justice Scalia's language, it's not dead, it's living, and its meaning can change, right? So in other words, due process of law as a phrase can change meaning. It can include other rights, right? Equal protection, right? Can change, right? It can include other rights. Now, this flexible approach certainly was used by the United States Supreme Court in the 1960s and roughly the first part of the 1970s to really expand civil rights and civil liberties in this country. Now, again, we won't go much further here, but we'll put that into practice in the next two chapters. All right. And then the last one is deference to the legislature. Okay. Now here, a justice interpreting the Constitution will not look at what Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, James Madison, and Jefferson thought about the Constitution. Won't get out the dictionary in terms of looking at it through literal meaning. Won't use a flexible approach, say, okay, what is society in 2018? What does it look like? So I need to apply the Constitution, make it fit to today's society. Here, this judge or justice will say, you know what? I want to see what the legislature meant. All right, so they will actually look at the legislative history, look at the committee debates, look at the full Senate and House floor debates, right? What did they mean? Now again, this could be in Congress, it could be in a state legislature, it could be city council, county commission, school board. What did they mean? All right, and you're deferring heavily to what the legislature meant when they put together this law. Now, with that said, as you might imagine, if you're deferring to a legislature, there is a little bit of a failure here when it comes to issues of the Constitution that are the Constitution, right? So again, when you look at the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, things like that, deliberately skipping the third, of course. quartering of soldiers just hasn't come up very often, as you might imagine. All right, but we'll talk about it as an unincorporated right here in a little bit. But again, no legislature wrote the First Amendment. No legislature wrote the Second Amendment. No legislature wrote the Fourth Amendment. So deference to legislature kind of fails when it comes to issues of the Constitution, where a legislature, be it Congress, state legislature, city council, school board, township trustees, village council, whatever, haven't written a law that's in question. Okay, now, last thing I want to do to kind of tighten some of this up, all right, is to kind of put labels on these approaches, right? These methods of constitutional interpretation. So we've looked at 4, okay? Now, I want to put them in 2 boxes, right? A conservative box and a liberal box, right? The first, second, and fourth tend to be approaches used by conservative judges and justices. Now, every now and again there's an exception, I get it, but what I would want you to know for the exam, and certainly moving forward, especially as we start putting a lot of this stuff into practice, right, is that original intent, literal meaning, all right, and deference to the legislature tend to be approaches used by conservative judges and justices. The normative approach, sometimes called the flexible approach, tends to be a liberal approach, okay, where the Constitution changes. So it means something different in 2018 than it did in 1918. And still in 1918 it meant something different than it did in 1818, okay? That society changes, it morphs, and so should the Constitution. Again, that in contrast to Justice Scalia's opinion, it's not dead, it's living, right? The ideas that can change, just like people can, if you will. Okay, now, with that said, all right, what I want to do, still talking about constitutional interpretation, is talk about some checks on the United States Supreme Court. Now, they're not in the outline, but I want to address them here, and again, I'll walk through them, and they're essentially 8 checks that I want to look at here. But I think they're important. Again, if you remember when we were in the Constitution chapter, rather, we were talking about what the framers thought should take place, and that would, in terms of building the government, that the legislature would be the most powerful form of government. Again, much more representative of the people. The House of Representatives, of course, directly elected at the time. Senate, not so, right? Not until much later when we had direct the 17th Amendment put into place direct election of U.S. senators. But nonetheless, I also made the comment that in practice, we either have executive supremacy, not legislative supremacy, or judicial supremacy. So what I want to do here is look at some of the limitations on judicial supremacy, and I think it's a good place to look at it here. Okay, now, some of these are mechanical, some of these are social, all right? So we'll make mention of that as we go through it. Okay, the first real limitation, real check on the United States Supreme Court is constitutional amendment, all right? So if you think about it, all right, if we as a society don't like the way the United States Supreme Court is interpreting the Constitution, we'll just amend it. Right? So if the United States Supreme Court says something such as, well, that statute's unconstitutional, well, you can always change the Constitution to make it constitutional. Okay? And the Supreme Court has done that a couple of different times, right? The Supreme Court has had that done to it a couple of different times where we said, well, you know, we got to fix that. So a classic example is probably the income tax, right? The income tax was ruled by the United States Supreme Court twice to be unconstitutional. Well, we as a society kind of got together and said, you know what? We're going to fix that, right? And we've had income taxes ever since, I guess. Okay. All right, and again, that's the 16th Amendment of the United States Constitution. It's kind of a funny one if you think about it. Okay, all right, second check. Again, when it comes to constitutional amendment, that's much more mechanical. This next one is social death. All right. Now, is it true that the United States Supreme Court justices have their job for life, right, during good behavior? If you look at the language in Article 3, well, yes, but they also die. Nobody lives forever. So the idea is you'll always get some changeover in the United States Supreme Court, largely because Mother Nature plays a role there. And again, justices circle the drain. Number 3, impeachment. All right. Can federal judges and Supreme Court justices be impeached? Now, this is much more mechanical, all right, legally. Federal judges have been impeached. They have been convicted. Okay, that happens. That's a limitation. Okay, number 4, both mechanical as well as social, and that's the very fact that justices can change precedent. Okay, so again, remember what we said when we first introduced this chapter. Precedent means treating like cases in a like manner. All right, well, that's not to say that precedent can't be changed. Very rare, but it's absolutely possible that precedent can be changed. Now, when we get into civil rights and civil liberties, we're going to see that a couple of cases. But probably the best example of this is the 58-year spread between two very, very powerful cases. The 1896 decision in Plessy versus Ferguson, where the United States Supreme Court said, yeah, you can have separate places of public accommodation as long as they're equal. And again, 58 years later, the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that, all right? You can't have places of public accommodation that are separate based on race and expect them to be equal. That's unconstitutional, all right? And again, we'll put that into practice a little bit later, okay? Now, number 5, and something we don't think about too often, but it is possible for the United States Supreme Court's membership to be changed by Congress. Okay, so if you look at Article 3 of the Constitution, nowhere does it state that we should have 9 justices. We've actually had as few as 6, right? Actually, when we birthed the United States Supreme Court, and we've had as many as 10. All right, we've had 9 for a long, long time, but that number 9, all right, is fixed by a federal statute. All right, so for about 140 years roughly, we've had 9 justices. All right, we'll talk about numbers here in a little bit. During President Roosevelt's tenure as president, he actually had threatened to do that. He wasn't, his legislative program wasn't meeting constitutional muster. That is to say, the Supreme Court wasn't upholding many parts of the New Deal. And he said, hey, you know, I'll just throw more justices on you and outnumber the ones that are voting against me. And it's known as the switch in time that saved 9, all right, 1937. All of a sudden, people on the Supreme Court kind of changed their mind, right? And started, oh, maybe the New Deal isn't all that bad. Now, again, we really don't know if it was that kind of peer pressure, but nonetheless. Okay, so that's 5. Number 6, it is possible for Congress to change the appellate jurisdiction of the United States Supreme Court. Now, again, the original jurisdiction of the United States Supreme Court is written in Article 3. You can't change that, all right? I'll give you a curveball here in a second, all right? But Congress does have the authority by statute to alter the appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. So again, if the Congress said, you know what, we don't like the Supreme Court hearing these cases, it can actually impose a statute. Now, all right, here's the curveball. Actually, I'm going to throw 2 curveballs at you. If Congress wrote a statute, right, saying we don't want the Supreme Court to hear certain types of cases on